mind because I realize that next Sunday is Palm Sunday. And so I'm going to cut the series short. It was supposed to be a 4-part series. It's going to end up being a 3-part series. Today is the last of the lesson, and it's been a very important lesson to me because it is celebrating the last 40 days of Master Jesus' life, ministry here on earth, which of course begins on Ash Wednesday, or began on Ash Wednesday, ends on Easter Sunday. And what the series has been about has been the 2 main principles that he used in performing most of his miracles, which of course were faith, you see that on the wall here, and the imagination, which is over here in blue. So in part 1, I introduced Unity's formation process: conceive, perceive, believe, achieve. And I focused on how these 4 steps really unfolded in Jesus' story of the prodigal son, the most popular Bible story of all his stories. And how the prodigal son, knowing that life was impossible for him, he had left home in anger, he had taken his money, he'd spent it, he squandered it, and broke some very important cultural rules, which meant that you never leave home until you're married. That would be a problem today, wouldn't it? Everybody would be living home. But in those days, you never left home before you were married, and you certainly didn't take your inheritance until your dad had gone. And so he did it, and he went out there and he squandered it, and he found himself feeding slop, giving the pigs the slop, the lowest possible job of his culture, who of course did not eat pork, and so they really didn't love pigs, and to slop the pigs was the lowest thing you could do. So he found himself there in that terrible place. And of course, since we interpret our Bible metaphysically, we know that the first thing in that story is that whenever we are down, so low that we're reaching up to touch bottom, there's still hope that we can create something new in our lives. And he gets the idea. Now, he knew he couldn't go home as a son. That's impossible because of all the rules he had broken. But he conceives the idea that he could go home as a servant because his father's servants ate better and slept better and had a much better life than he had, slopping pigs and having to eat the slop. It was the only food he had. So he, of course, absolutely comes up, conceives this idea, and then he perceives it. He starts to imagine it. He starts to imagine himself living as a servant in his father's house and eating the food that the servants got, which was really good food, and sleeping in a real bed and having a roof over his head. And he starts to imagine it and feel it. And once he really was able to see it, he could believe it before he saw it. And so through faith, he believes that this is possible for him. And of course, once we start to believe that something is possible, before we see it, once that faith is triggered in us, we're able to just feel it and see it. And then once that happens, we achieve it. He returns home, and not only is he welcomed at home, he's welcomed as a son. The father will have no part of the servant thing, and he comes back as a son. Which of course to us means that whenever we get to a point where we really can conceive and perceive and believe and achieve, we always get more than we ask for. And so he gets more than he asked for. And of course, Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, would say that he molded and shaped substance into his dream, into what he wanted to see. And of course, I did the following week, I told a personal story about how I shaped and molded substance, how I was able to conceive, perceive, imagine, believe, and achieve the car of my dreams, which I said was kind of a superficial dream, but when you're in your 30s, that's what you have, is superficial dreams. And then you realize as you get older that what's really important is not so much things outside of you, but things that happen inside. And today, I'm going to metaphysically interpret another Bible story, another one of Master Jesus' stories, and to show you how that every character in these stories symbolizes a part of our own consciousness, and how these stories all show that Jesus really used faith and imagination with all his characters to show that anything is possible for you. And it's even possible when you're reaching up to touch bottom. Because we like to think that we can create these wonderful things when we're feeling great, when we're really up there, when our consciousness is really high, when everything is just snapping perfectly for us. But we think that maybe when we're really down in the pits, we can't create something. So these stories will show us that, yes, we can. It doesn't matter where we find ourselves in consciousness. There's always the opportunity to move up and create something important in our lives. And in these Bible stories, of course, every character symbolizes an aspect of our own consciousness. I love analyzing these stories. It reminds me of being an English teacher when we would analyze characters and settings in books. It's exactly the same way in the Bible. So the setting here is an invalid lying by this pool. It was called the Pool of Bethesda. And he's lying by this pool on his little pallet because he's an invalid. And Jesus comes by and sees him lying there and commands him to get up and walk. And he does. But let me give you the setting and the background of the story. First of all, this ancient pool of Bethesda was supposedly a mystical pool. And the reason they considered it a mystical pool was because once every year, an angel jumped into the pool, stirred up the waters, and anybody who jumped in when the waters were stirred up by the angel would be healed. Didn't matter what they had, what condition they had. If they could jump in when the angel had stirred up those waters, they would be healed. It's kind of like Lourdes in France, where people go and a lot of people are healed just by being there. So you could, in your mind's eye, imagine that everybody seems to know what season or what day or whenever the angel's going to be in, and they're kind of watching and sending messengers out to people who are sick. Hurry, hurry, it's stirred up, it's ready, and everybody jumping into the pool. Meanwhile, this invalid is lying there hoping that somebody would help him in. But everybody's so concerned about themselves that they ignore him and he never gets help. So he's been lying there for like 30 years. Waiting for somebody to help him when the waters are stirred up, when those curative waters are flowing, and nobody ever does. So Jesus comes by and sees all this. He doesn't, obviously the water's not stirred up in the story when Jesus comes by, but he's lying there by the pool, and Jesus says to him, "What are you doing here?" And he says, well, he starts to give his poor me story. "Oh, well, let me tell you, I've been here for so long, nobody ever helped me, that's my mama." And so Jesus will have no part of that poor me story. He will have no part of victimhood. So he says to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And the guy does. Now, how does this happen? It happens because, and it could have happened in this point of this is that this can happen instantaneous for us. We can conceive an idea like instantly, suddenly, "Oh my God, I never thought that I could get up and walk. It never occurred to me that I could ever stand up from this mat and walk without being dumped into the pool." And then in an instant you start to perceive what it would be like to be able to walk. I wonder what, it's been so long since I've walked. Could I get up and walk? And you start to think about it, and you start to feel it, and you start to imagine that it's possible, and then you believe, because there was such power in Jesus' word and in his energy and in his consciousness, that the man believed it, totally believed it. There was no doubt in his mind that he could get up from that mat and walk away. And because he believed it before he saw it, he was able to get up and walk away. And so the curative power of the water never got to touch him, but the curative power in the word of someone with a very high consciousness like Jesus works every time. And so he did exactly that. He got up and he walked and he gave up his victimhood. Now let's look at the story metaphysically. Metaphysically, of course, Jesus symbolizes that spiritual awareness in us that says, you know what, you can do this differently? Have you ever thought of trying to maybe get up off have a walk? Or have you ever thought that maybe you can have whatever car you want? Or have you ever thought that maybe you really could go home again and live in your home and sleep on a real bed? So the power of conception, the power of coming up with a dream happens to us because that spiritual awareness at the core of our being is always there, reminding us that this is possible for us, that we can do so much more than we think we can do. That power is always there to awaken us to the truth about us, that nothing is impossible to those who believe, as Jesus once said, and that God's presence within us is our only safety. And so we can dwell on that to bring about whatever we want to see in our lives. Now, had the invalid remembered that, because that was in him too, he wouldn't have spent years and years and years lying on that, by that pool, feeling victimized. But sometimes we just forget it. It's not that something has to come in there from outside of us and remind us it's there, but we forget. And as the American poet Robert Browning once said, "My business is not to remake myself, but to make the absolute best of what God made." And so when we recognize that what we want to do is make the absolute best of what God made, we start to listen to that voice. And the pallet on which the invalid had been lying for 30 years symbolizes our excuses, our fears, our reasons for not being whole, the fears that keep us from making the absolute best of what God has made. Because we just have all those fears and we keep dwelling on them and giving them power. And those fears keep us from remembering that our source, that God within us is our only safety. And that when we look within, we get the answers we need. A Course in Miracles says, the awareness that there is nothing to fear shows that somewhere in your mind, though not necessarily in a place you recognize as yet, you have remembered God in you and let His strength take the place of your weakness. So it's there, but we have to remember it. And just as the invalid had to get into that water, or just as he believed that he had to get into that water in order to be healed, into that curative pool at Bethesda, when the angel stirred up the water, our source of healing is always within us, and we have to get in there. We have to be willing to dip into that source of healing at the core of our being. And the way it works is that God's presence at the core of our being always responds to us intelligently through universal law. And that universal law then receives the direct impression of our thoughts and acts upon them. Once our co-founder Myrtle Fillmore, the prodigal son, Julie Johnson, and the invalid at Bethesda believed that their dream was possible, universal law started acting and started working. And once we all saw life with a single eye, that dream was where we put our energy, then what happens is we're putting 100% of our energy into the dream, and the presence of God in us receives the imprint of that thought and acts upon it. It's all very logical and all working all the time. And once that happens, circumstances in our lives start to change. Just the fact that Jesus happened to walk by that pool changed the circumstances of the life of the invalid at Bethesda. And sometimes it's someone else that implants that thought for you. Jesus gave him that thought. Maybe he was just lying there in his victimhood, and along comes Jesus and says, what are you doing here? Why don't you get up? Why don't you do something about your life? Sometimes it's someone or something that just, and we've all experienced it, we can all tell stories about how it happened to us. Something or someone wakes you up, and then you go within to that God presence in you and do the rest. And so I'm going to end my lesson today with one of my favorite poems. You know, as I've said so many times, school teachers never die, they just become ministers. And so this is one of my favorites. It's called Thoughts Are Things. I hold it true that thoughts are things. They're endowed with bodies, breath, and wings, and that we send them forth to fill the world with good results or ill. That which we call a secret thought spreads forth to earth's remotest spot, leaving its blessings or its woes before it as it goes. Yet, so the universe is wrought. Thought is another name for fate. So choose your destiny and wait. For love brings love, and hate brings hate. God bless you. Oh, I forgot the affirmation. The affirmation is, I choose my destiny and wait. Let's say that together. I choose my destiny and wait.